Looks like we're live.
That's what it says. I'm trying to decide if I should be doing finger puppets or something. I hope we're not truly live, but we might be, so we should be circumspect about whom we talk about and what we talk about.
I think we're live, which may mean that we
Right.
should get started.
Well, I guess so. So why don't we assume that we're live? And so I'm Fred Tutman. I'm the Patuxent River Keeper, and we have an august panel. I'll let them introduce themselves so I don't mess up a name or a title or something like that. We do have a theme, but let's do the introductions first and then see if we can unpack this subject we don't have a whole lot of time to talk about. So, Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali, why don't you go first? Tell us who you are, where you're from, and how you got here.
Thank you, Fred. Yeah. Hey, everybody. I'm Mustafa Santiago Ali. I'm the Executive Vice President of the National Wildlife Federation, founder of Revitalization Strategies, and was blessed to work at EPA for 24 years of federal service. And I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Fantastic. And Marianne Engelman Lotto. Sorry, I got your. That's
No,
why
you got my name just right. Marian Engelman Lotto. Nice to see you, and nice to be here. I just came off of almost a year of helping to launch our EPA's new Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights, and today's my second day back in the Office of General Counsel at EPA. And I've been with EPA for 2.5 years, and look to Mustafa for his long experience at the agency. And before that, worked in civil rights, both in nonprofits and in legal clinics.
Wonderful. So the posted caption for our workshop is Black Lives Matter and the Supreme Court. What does the recent affirmative action ruling mean for the EJ movement? And of course, that ruling they're talking about is this Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard recent Supreme Court decision that affects how colleges can factor race considerations into their admission criteria. So the question I'd like to ask, just to get the ball rolling, is kind of global. Why would someone think that a case in front of the Supreme Court about college admissions would have anything at all to do with EJ and the willingness of folks to pursue EJ objectives? What's the connectivity there? Why would people assume? Anyone want to whack at that?
Maybe I'll jump in.
Please.
You know, it's an interesting dynamic. So we have to also understand the history of our country and how race was a driver in policy to have the impacts that we currently see going on. Whether we're talking about redlining, restrictive covenants, the use of zoning, and decisions that are made in that space can either have positive or negative impacts. So when the Supreme Court begins to take a look at race in relationship to admissions to college, it also begins to set a set of opportunities for them to, if other cases move forward, to be able to look at other areas in our American life where race may be a criteria for decision making. Now, we need to also just make sure that people are clear that in the past, many of the things have been extremely detrimental to our communities, especially Black and Brown, Indigenous, and lower wealth communities. And because of policy, we find ourselves in that space. And of course, when the Supreme Court makes a ruling, it impacts policy. It impacts policy both at the Environmental Protection Agency, at Housing and Urban Development, at the Department of Transportation, so forth and so on. So we have to pay particular attention to things that are happening by the judicial branch that will have huge impact, can have huge impacts into how resources move and how decisions are made, and hopefully, and how we can help our communities to move from surviving to thriving. And if it is on the negative side, then in many instances, those communities that are already thriving may move back to just surviving.
Understood. Well, surviving, obviously, we need to do a little better than just survive. So Marianne, I know that there's some areas that you can't quite go to just based on your current position, but can we talk a little bit about things that the federal government, the EPA, for example, might do to help keep these initiatives intact and to stay the course? Can you
Sure.
give thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, let me start by just saying that the environmental justice movement has deep roots. And the literature coming out of the environmental justice movement has really affirmed what many communities around the country have talked about, have known, have seen in their own communities, that there's a relationship between race, color, national origin, and income and other factors. But let's just focus on race, color, national origin for a moment, and exposure to environmental hazards, particulate matter, which affects the lungs, like little pieces of dust, and other contaminants. And also, there's a relationship between race, color, and national origin, and living in proximity, going to school in proximity, going to work in proximity to health hazards. So that is fundamental to the environmental justice movement. And as Mustafa suggested, it is fundamental to the environmental justice movement to do something about it, to change the way in which we operate the environmental sector in this country, so that people who are affected have a say. Think of that as procedural justice. And also to ensure that everybody has a fair chance in this country to have clean air, clean water. And, I think we can all agree that our access to a healthy place to play, clean air, clean water should not be related to race, color, national origin. And that's been at the heart of the environmental justice movement. So the movement has deep roots. It responds to real concerns. It's backed by literature. And right now in the federal government, there are unprecedented commitments to advancing environmental justice consistent with law. And this is being done in a whole bunch of ways that are really not tremendously affected by the court's decision, as important as these court decisions are. Hey, Carlton Waterhouse. So those unprecedented commitments, just briefly, include funding levels under the Inflation Reduction Act and under bill that's getting billions of dollars out to communities. The launch of programs at EPA. We have the launch of the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights. The Department of Justice has a structure for environmental justice. The White House now has an environmental justice office. And structures may seem removed from communities, but there are ways in which we can integrate this work, take it from the margins to the center, to recognize how important it is to address issues of equity, and to that we need to be targeting resources. We need to be meaningfully engaging communities that are most affected. We'll talk more about some of these efforts, but I do want to say that they will continue, and that we can do them consistent with the law.
So I want to acknowledge that Professor Waterhouse has joined us. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself before you join our conversation.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Absolutely.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I'm joining you from the campus of the Howard University School of Law, where I'm here with my environmental law class as we are joining you all to participate in the symposium. And so we appreciate this opportunity to be a part of the conversation as it is ongoing. I think, as some of you know, I'm a professor of law at Howard University School of Law. And from 2021 until 2023, recently, I served in the Biden-Harris administration, providing leadership to the Office of Land and Emergency Management at the Environmental Protection Agency. And so Marion was one of my coworkers at EPA. And I'm very excited about being back at the law school, as well as I was excited about my opportunity there working in administration, and just glad to be here today.
So we're in the process of kind of connecting the idea that this Supreme Court decision that we're discussing may have some trickle down or effect on the environmental justice movement. I have a couple of reflections I'd like to quickly share, because I reread that decision over the weekend, and what jumped out of me in the dissent, particularly from Justice Jackson, was the idea that race is somehow a defining factor sometimes in terms of the kinds of privileges and the kinds of access that people have. And moreover, that environmental justice, like the things that people might look at in college admissions, are also transgenerational things as well. And those really leapt out at me as some things that were correlations between the kinds of things that people might look at in a college admissions context, but also in terms of the kinds of injustices that exist at large in the society, right, that people don't have control over, right? The transgenerational stuff, the fact that skin color or race or identification is something that might be taken into consideration in general in the society in terms of your prospects and your potential. And so I think that's a correlation as well, that people might try and make the comparison that something in a college admissions context may also apply generally in terms of, 14th Amendment protections, which are intriguing to me, right? The idea that 14th Amendment protections are a barrier rather than a call to action. You're following me? These are ideas that I think kind of flow like a river. And yet we're trying to find ways to find good policy, right, that both preserves constitutional protections but also raises equity. Am I wrong?
Well, at least from my perspective, I'll jump in and say, no, I don't think you're wrong. But the history of the United States Supreme Court suggests to me that their agenda may or may not be consistent with the framers of the Equal Protection Clause, because in some generations of the court, they were trying to frustrate the behavior of that exact same Congress as they passed legislation, and they took the position that the federal government was limited in their ability to protect African Americans in particular from racial discrimination that was taking place in the broader society. And so I can't say necessarily that the Supreme Court's primary goal is to produce equity, or that their primary goal in issuing that decision was to produce a better outcome for the whole society or people of color. But they were advancing what I think is their general predisposition as a majority towards restricting anti-discrimination law in particular, and restricting efforts to advance equity. I think the Supreme Court sees anything that is race conscious, running contrary to their formalistic interpretation of the Constitution. And a formalistic interpretation of the Constitution basically says they're not concerned about the spirit of the law, they're concerned about the letter of the law, and they're interpreting the letter of the law in Equal Protection Clause to say you can't talk about race when you're making decisions. Now, of course, that's out of the context of the history of the Equal Protection Clause. It's out of the context of the history of the precedents that are part of the Supreme Court's record. For example, during the Civil Rights era, in cases like Brown versus the Board of Education, and a string of other cases. But it is consistent with their judicial philosophy and their conservative political agenda. So from the standpoint of environmental justice, I do think what it does more than a legal matter is to frame for the larger society and provide evidence for members of the society who also don't like the idea of equity being advanced by societal institutions from a racial perspective, to pull back, to resist, to drag their feet. And so there was a lot of positive momentum created in 2020 in the society to advance racial equity as a goal. And now I think this opinion helps to reinforce people who are disinclined, and for those who are on the fence, to see this maybe as not the way we want to go. I don't think there's a lot of legal risk associated with environmental justice as a result of the opinion, but I think it does in some ways politically pull us back to the early 2000s, where a lot of the arguments about environmental justice were being framed in the context of the Bush administration, that this should not be something we should be looking at as a race conscious matter, that it should just be advancing environmental protection on a race neutral basis. And that we see from decades of practice is not an effective way to address longstanding legacy of discrimination that dates all the way back to redlining in most cities of the United States. The environmental justice footprint that we see, the environmental injustice footprint that we see in American cities can be dated back to the 1930s and 40s, and racial discrimination that took place in the way that loans were being given to give housing. And so how can we use a race neutral method that ignores a historical legacy of intentional racial discrimination as an expected way to eliminate that longstanding problem? I think that's a difficult challenge. I know the EPA is committed to doing that, and I'm hopeful that they will find ways to do it. But I think private industry, local governments, and individual citizens who aren't bound by the same constraints that EPA may be bound by should be focused on changing outcomes for communities. And that's really, I think, where we need to lean in around environmental justice and doing whatever it takes to make sure we can change those outcomes using the mechanisms that are available before us.
I hear you. Mustafa, on your side of the street, is this kind of decision likely to have some trickle down in terms of how nonprofits, big greens, interact with their own agenda for diversity, inclusion, equity, or not?
I think that there is the possibility. I think there is a possibility of that. Let me just also share in our conversation that the Supreme Court seems to be operating from an extractive paradigm. And what I mean by that is that they continue to extract opportunities, they continue to extract protections, and they continue to extract people's ability to be able to protect their lives effectively. So what do I mean by that? Extracting opportunities by limiting the opportunities for students of color to finally be able to be represented in our higher education system in the fullness and fairness that America should be focused on. When you look at not just this particular case, but you look at what they did around the waters of the U.S. rule, understanding that it is, our communities, and when I say our communities, I mean Black and Brown, Indigenous, and lower wealth communities, who are the ones who continue to have to deal with the pollution that is associated with our various water bodies, then you are literally extracting the opportunity to be healthier. When they move forward on cases around, clean power, the clean power plant rule, and those different types of things, we understand that disproportionately it is our communities who are the ones who are getting sick and the ones who are losing their lives. Harvard put a study out a couple years ago. Over 350,000 lives are being lost prematurely because of the burning of fossil fuels. Everyone go Google it. Anytime somebody's sitting in front of you talking, you should make sure that you are fact checking them as well. So this extractive set of actions has also emboldened individuals to begin to put pressure on corporations to say, you know what, you shouldn't have DEI as a part of the areas that you're focusing on. And of course, we understand that the next step from DEI is then to be able to say, well, those climate goals, those environmental justice goals that you may have, those probably aren't something that you should be focusing on. You'll see additional pressures also placed on foundations. Now, foundations, of course, will make a choice if they want to go with that or not. But there are these ripple effects that we often don't talk about in relationship to these decisions that are being made. And I'll just add the other part, because I don't think we can talk about the Supreme Court without talking about the power that exists inside of our vote. And we don't utilize it properly, then the judicial system begins to get out of whack, because we have a lot of power in helping to determine whom are going to sit on our various judgeships, whether it's at the Supreme Court or it's in federal court, or if it's, all the way down the line. So it is all interconnected. And there are those, I'll just call it out, there are parties that have had a plan for dozens and dozens of years around how do you better utilize the judicial system to get the things that you want and to mold America in the way that you see fit. So I'll stop there.
Wow. Marianne, is there some safe space in there for you to maneuver?
Absolutely. So part of what we're talking about is what the court said and the confines and parameters of what the court said. And then part of what we're talking about is how that may or may not constrain what we do in the federal government and state government and local government, stakeholders, what to advocate for, how to make the change that we need to make. And Carlton teed it up, is what we're all about is changing outcomes for communities. That's what it's about. And particularly addressing those disparities on the basis of race, color, and national origin in this country. It cannot be acceptable. It cannot be acceptable that we have a distribution of health hazards that is correlated with race, color, and national origin. That has to be something we change. So we should all be in agreement with that. So how, if at all, does the court's decision constrain what we can do? Well, I would posit, there's a lot of interest in the court's decisions, and we have to keep our eye on the ball there. But there is nonetheless a lot we can do. So, I really want to focus on that and focus on the fact that we are trying to move the ball forward, and all of us, wherever we are, need to figure out those spaces to move the ball forward. So what do I mean by that? The first days in office, the president signed executive orders 14008, which created the White House Environmental Justice Council and the White House Advisory Council, both a community-based council and an interagency council, to move forward on environmental justice. And of course, environmental justice means that we're delivering services, we're meaningfully engaging communities, we are providing just treatment without regard to race, color, national origin. That is, we have to address these inequalities, that protection of the government should not be unequal, right? That is something we need to address. And again, there's so much we need to do. He also signed Executive Order 13985 in the opening days of the administration, and that called on every agency to put together an equity plan. So we're doing that. We put together equity plans. People can find them online. At EPA, that included advancing community-based participatory science. That is critical for environmental justice, for communities to have more ownership, more say, more tools to get their story out, to make change, to advocate. It included changing our procurement policy. Our procurement policies need to ensure that our money is going out in effective and fair ways, consistent with principles of equity. It called on us to ensure that we develop our capacity to work with communities by providing language access, ensuring we're open for people with disabilities, being culturally competent. It also required us to work with communities to build community capacity in partnership. And now we've got these thriving communities technical assistance centers all across the country that are providing one-stop shop for more information, for grant writing, for grant navigation, to build capacity in communities, as well as billions of dollars going out targeted to disadvantaged communities. All of these things and far more, greater civil rights enforcement, far more can be done consistent with the law. I'll close by saying, in addition to all that, we now have 2 more executive orders. All of this is consistent with the law, right? All of it, even under the new law. We have an executive order that recognizes equity is not a one-time deal. Every year, each agency now has to do an equity plan to look at ways in which barriers to equity affect our delivery of services and our programs. And we're just putting the finishing touches on a new equity plan that really reinforces these priorities while we implement them. And then, of course, this spring, the president signed a new environmental justice executive order 14096. And that really, it has really delivers or calls on all of us to deliver in a way that I think is really important to lift up. Of course, the original executive order signed by the President Clinton, 12898, specifically called out that agencies must evaluate whether or not their activities disproportionately affect communities on the basis of race, color, national origin. And that executive order is part of the important, almost religious history in this country, right, of how we move forward toward equity. But President Biden took the bold step of saying, let's review it, let's update it. Now, some of it just needed to be updated, like the language of minority is sort of old language that nobody uses, and in legislation, we now use different language. States across the country have EJ legislation, they use different language. So some of that is just updating. But there were also really important principles to put in there. So now there's a definition of environmental justice that is true to the history of Executive Order 12898, which is still in place, and still calls on agencies to evaluate whether their activities have a disproportionate effect on the basis of race, color, national origin, and income, but also now disability. And also taking account of, and this is really important, the legacy of racism and other structural barriers. So now agencies must evaluate whether our activities are reinforcing and exacerbating that legacy of racism. That is all consistent with the state of the law. And we're directed by the president to take these actions. So there's just so much we can and must do to address these disparities that continue to exist, and also, as Carlton said, to deliver fairness, deliver change outcomes in communities.
So, if I may, let me unpack a case study to try and help us kind of unpack how complex it can be to communicate these initiatives, particularly over people's sense of entitlement, the sensitivity that maybe the balance of equities are changing within the society. Let's assume that they're right sizing, right? And that a change in the dynamic in terms of how people of color are treated and what we have access to may be perceived as competing with entitlements, right, that others have. So here's my little quick case study. So a couple of years ago, the state of Maryland gave my organization a grant of funds because they recognized that there was a cold spot in terms of summer youth programs in Brandywine, Maryland. And so they asked us to start a summer camp, and we did. And we prioritized the outreach to touch Brandywine. And no sooner did we do that, but I had 2 phone calls from people who happened to be white who said, "Oh, are you excluding white kids?" Which blew my mind because it wasn't in the literature. No one said that. No one felt that. But I did understand that the idea that we were prioritizing one area of disparity was perceived by at least someone as robbing someone else of an opportunity, which I think is a confusion I think that people have, and it does kind of go to people's touchy-feely zones about what they're used to and what they're accustomed to and what they know and what they see. So how does one, I guess to put a point on it, come up with race? If at one end of the spectrum is race neutrality and the other end of the spectrum is racial sensitivity, where do we find that space, that airspace, where we can talk about these programs, without excluding someone, without taking something away from someone else that was, might have been well earned or entitled to? Do you see the problem that I have? How do we even talk about this stuff going forward as a practical matter, given that people are siloed?
Well, I would like to start off in a way that I didn't originally, which is to just thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this panel. And it's an honor to be here with such august members like yourself, as well as Dr. Ali and Ms. Lotto. I'm really just very fortunate to be here with you all. I do think one of the ways that this is very different than the Supreme Court opinion is that in that case, you're talking about individuals. And in our cases, we're talking about communities. And so that case is mostly about making benefits available for individuals, and the court saying you have to do it on an individual basis, not based on their racial identity. But here we're talking about eliminating problems that other communities that are already in existence. Mm-hmm. And in that context, there's no reason why this opinion would in any way forestall eliminating pollution in certain communities, reducing pollution in certain communities, making green space available in certain communities. Those communities clearly don't keep out individuals of different racial identities from living or moving there. And most of the time, those communities aren't necessarily 100% of any particular racial identity or group. And so there isn't anything in this opinion that should stop us from moving forward to advance environmental justice and equity in the environmental space in terms of the availability of environmental benefits or eliminating or reducing environmental burdens.
So to be clear, adding more trees or green space to a person of color neighborhood doesn't necessarily take it away from some white neighborhood someplace else, majority neighborhood, right? I mean, that I think that's the paradox that I'm dealing with, is the perception that you're shortchanging someone by simply right-sizing their benefit or their privilege.
And it doesn't, and I'd say even further, those communities that are white may not be all white, 100% white. There can be people of color in those communities, and these communities of color may not be 100% any particular group either, but that's not really the key issue. The key issue is, does that community in that location have a benefit that should be made available to them? And does a community in that location have to carry as heavy a burden? And the argument is that we should not overburden these communities. And particularly because of the legacy of racial discrimination, we do know there's a historic burden that should be lightened.
Right. Let me add to that, because I think it's an important conversation. We need to be targeting resources where they're needed most. So if we're thinking about, where do we plant trees? Well, where are trees needed, right? And it could be they're needed in communities that have fewer trees and that are, very hot in this moment of climate change. And we know from research, those tend to be communities of color. But we can look at where are there fewer trees, and we can plant trees in those communities. We have a lot of information. And there are a lot of screening tools out there, whether it's EJ Screen or CGEST or state screening tools, CalEnviroScreen. Now CDC has a cumulative impacts index. The Centers for Disease Control has a cumulative impacts index that visually represent, using lots of layers of data, different data, and you can look at it in different ways, but have lots of layers of data about which communities have higher numbers of people with disabilities. What is length of life? Where are Superfund sites? And depending on what we're trying to target, we can look at that information and make decisions about targeting resources, prioritizing in communities that need it most. Now, again, we know there's a relationship to race. Let me just use CalEnviroScreen for a second. California is using its screening tool, its data mapping tool, and it has census data, it has California-based data. It has been using its data mapping tool for many, many years. And there's criticism of it. There are all kinds of back and forth. It publishes on its website an analysis it does every time they update it. I think they're at CalEnviroScreen 4.0. But every time they update it, they relate that to whether or not, how it would look if they used race as one of the indicators. The truth is, unfortunately, that there's a huge correlation with using their index even without using race. It's on the order of a 0.9 correlation for those who want to take a look. And the reason is precisely all the things we're talking about, that because of our history, because of our decision making, communities of color people live less long. They're more in proximity to health hazards. These are the things we need to address. And if we address them, we will begin to make a lot more progress on racial disparities. So we can use CalEnviroScreen, and it's been used even in a state where there are real prohibitions on the use of race in decision making. CalEnviroScreen is used for determining priorities in underground storage tank inspections and giving out funds. And it's being used very effectively. So all of these screening tools can help us direct money, direct resources, and then we can go back and use census data and look at, did we address those racial disparities? And if we haven't, we can continue to take action to address the racial disparities and to target resources and our activities where they're needed most. So there is a lot we can do that will get at these issues, and they're not trade-offs. They're really not. They're being more effective at targeting our work where it's needed most.
Yeah, and I wonder how well that's understood at street level. Like I said, I've been a river keeper and a community organizer for longer than I've been a river keeper. I know in whiter communities, the presumption is that the environmental benefits that exist there came from hard work and various things that they've done that were good, and indeed they might have. But the perception of the deficiencies, environmental deficiencies that exist in blacker communities, are generally presumed to be slow. These people didn't work hard. They didn't try hard. They didn't get good grades. Any number of excuses and rationales that I've heard that essentially, I think, position us as citizens almost in competition. We're not really trying to get equity for all. We're trying to get the most for ourselves. And so that big picture analysis, that holistic view, I think is pretty hard to find in a race-saturated society, to be honest, or for that matter, in a race-saturated movement. It's always been obvious to me as an environmentalist working and interacting in the environmental community that race is almost defining in some cases in terms of what you can and cannot do, whom you can reach, whom you can access. I mean, those are, but again, at street level, I think people port into this stuff from their own perspective, which may not be holistic at all. It's just, they want what they think they're entitled to, regardless, of what the realities are. So I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is it's something I think we're going to struggle with because I think people come to this with their own heart. And
I just want to say one thing. Mustafa looks like he's about to jump in, and I want to hear what he has to say. But just we should all find a way to uphold values of fairness to all. And fairness to all includes people of color, includes white folks, includes poor folks, includes everyone. And if we have fewer trees in our community, that's unfair. That means your community is hotter. And so putting more trees in those communities is not a trade-off of one versus another. We have to learn how to talk about this, how to express ourselves, and how to find that commonality so we get this across. And I feel lucky to be part of an administration where the value is fairness to all, is equity. But I don't, I hear you. I think we have a long way to go as a society to stop seeing it as a trade-off and start seeing it as building a society where we can all work together.
A part of it is that we have often operated from a scarcity paradigm instead of moving to an abundance paradigm and being able to expand that out so that everyone can have the resources that are necessary to be able to build the capacity, to be able to change the dynamics that are going on. And unfortunately, it's not, I don't think it's taught in our educational system, but somehow it becomes a part of the core way that many people in our country think. Give you an example. The injustices that happen to Black farmers, how now there's 10% of Black farms left from the total amount that were before, and how people, certain folks, came together to block resources being able to go to those Black farmers. That goes, I hope it's from a scarcity paradigm and not from a racial or a racist paradigm, but we still see the dynamics that play out in that space. This is a transformational moment and an opportunity for us to really change the way that we view helping communities to be revitalized. This is an opportunity also to make sure if you're a community in West Virginia or Appalachia, or if you're in Puerto Rico, Alaska, or in the breadbasket or in the Rust Belt, former Rust Belt, that there are resources, there are tools to be able to make change happen. If we can get people through education, that's why I'm thankful that we have both Mary Ann and Professor Waterhouse here, because they've dedicated their lives also to education, which is so critically needed in our country and lacking, because most folks have no idea, one, about the history, but two, about the sets of opportunities, the best practices that have been implemented, even when there were limited resources to be able to make change. And now we overlay this moment with the resources to be able to truly transform our communities, our most vulnerable communities, our country, and the planet. But that is going to require folks to actually be able to translate language into things that everyday folks can get their minds around. Mrs. Ramirez, Mr. Johnson, Mr. O'Leary. And if we don't do that, then I think we're going to continue to allow the small group of individuals who want division, who want us not to be able to move forward in the 21st century in a way that folks expect us to become a reality. So if we don't do that, then I think we're going to continue to have these starts and stops that the climate crisis and a number of other crises demand that we do not get caught up in.
Well, this all resonates with me. And I've always thought that it also requires better conversations. We have to get better, I think, as Americans, at talking to each other in a very divided a very divided time, let's say, in our evolution as a country, right? It's very, very hard to have those conversations. The night of the last election, I had thought I would have a party for my neighbors, both Republican and Democrat. And I concluded that it was almost impossible to do because the enmity was so high at the end of that last election, right? That it was, how was I going to get those people in the same room drinking beer and communicating with each other as Americans? I didn't know how to do it. I'm still trying to find ways to mentor and sponsor those types of conversations, because I think they do lead to better community-based solutions, that people do get a better understanding of the context behind these programs, rather than something being taken away from them personally, but rather something being corrected that was deficient or broken or unjust to begin with. I'll close that part of my comments by saying, too, that it has been problematic for me to see the environmental justice movement not well integrated within the green movement generally. It's an outboard cause movement, one that's kind of provisional. Sometimes we're doing environmental justice work, and sometimes we're doing other work, as though somehow environmental justice is a separate set of values from these movements that are primarily focused on nature. How do we correct that? How do we make environmental justice much more integral, much more prominent in these movements generally? Because I think those would be better movements, frankly. How do we do that?
Well, I do a little bit of that. I've worked in over 1,000 communities now. So, and they all have some similar dynamics, but, folks look different in all those communities. Look at the conservation movement, right? Um, when we look at the impacts that are happening to our forests, when we look at impacts that are happening to wildlife, one of the things that I share with folks, that same pollution that's making Black and brown folks and indigenous folks sick is the same pollution that's having significant impacts on our forests, same impacts that are happening to wildlife, and of course, are also a driver in the climate crisis. You have to create on-ramps. I really appreciate the work that's going on in the current administration and thinking critically about how do we create on-ramps. I've talked about it for years, right? Because communities are holistic entities. They have all these different needs and sets of opportunities that exist inside of them. And when you can have a interagency working group sort of set of actions going on, and that means whether you have a housing issue or a transportation issue or a healthcare issue or environmental issue or a number of the other things, that there is an on-ramp for you. The other part of it is that you have to make sure that all kinds of different folks are actually being impacted by the sets of challenges that are going on. So I often talk about, along with, yes, the most prominent disproportionate impact are happening to Black and brown and indigenous folks, but lower wealth white communities are also catching it. And that's why I appreciate the work of Reverend Barber, taking the work from Dr. Martin Luther King around, the moral majority and bringing so many different types of folks together. So what we have to do, once again, is going back to education and helping folks understand that there are these sets of impacts that are happening to so many different types of folks, and that there's also a set of opportunities in this current moment to be able to address the sets of needs that you might have. And that's why I talk about moving from surviving to thriving. We can make that become a reality for all communities. And we also have to be very clear with history that certain folks have been more disproportionately impacted than others. And that's why you also see some folks that were very disappointed, some people angry with some of the Supreme Court decisions because they understood the intentionality in the past of making sure that those impacts were happening in Black and brown and lower wealth communities. And that's why folks are saying, well, if you were intentional in the past, why can't we be intentional here in this moment and moving forward? But we also have to understand the way that the law works, and we have to utilize it to make sure that we're making real change happen.
So let's boil it down. In the aftermath of this decision and other similar conversations occurring in our society, we need to have better conversations. We need to double down, I guess, on the cause of justice and equity. Presumably, we have to stay the course on programs that we've initiated and create more opportunities that are on-ramps for people of all walks to participate and deliberate and communicate. What else? What else can we do as a practical matter to the folks listening to this conversation? Tips.
One thing I'll add, I think Marion has some technical problems, so she'll join us again in a moment. But one thing I'd like to add to this conversation that I think has already pointed out some excellent steps is the fact that the scarcity model that I think Dr. Ali has identified so appropriately, that model of thinking actually is inapplicable. In the sense that what we really need to do is to work towards reducing pollution because it inures to everybody's benefit. And we need to work towards increasing the green spaces around the country because it works to everyone's benefit. We all benefit from having more trees. We all benefit from having less pollution. Some of us are impacted more directly by having more pollution, but all of us benefit from having less of it ultimately. And so when we take the perspective that we're really just benefiting this one giant ecosystem we have on this globe by reducing the amount of pollution and increasing the amount of spaces that are healthy and habitable for human beings and for animals, that's a good thing for everybody. So to some degree, from a human nature standpoint, we may have to make sure we focus on where the winds are and that the winds are not isolated. And I think there's the immediate effects where the winds are direct, but there are indirect benefits from the winds that are going on everywhere. And I think by helping people to recognize that, we do see greater coalition building. I think that's why the green movements are doing more work towards environmental justice than they were doing 20 years ago. I think there's a recognition, a greater level of recognition, because of the success of Dr. Ali and others, to make clear to some of the leadership in those organizations that if we want to address climate, we're going to have to address it with a full cadre of soldiers from all the communities around the country and around the world. And we're going to have to make sure we are protecting those people and we are engaging around their issues. Because there has been a historic, though, dichotomy that you've mentioned, Mr. Tutman, it's going to take time and it's going to take work to turn those, loose coalitions into newly framed, fully fleshed out movements that appreciate why all of these are priorities for all of us. And so I think if we have the long view, we as a species can recognize we need to move towards circular economy. We need to move away from extractive industries, use, and then wasting. And I think as we create a more environmentally, ecologically informed mindset for the American citizen, we will all be able to see more clearly together why we want environmental equity for all. But I think that's a long haul, to be very honest. And I think those of us who are fighting toward it have to remain hopeful and avoid the low road, because the low road will become very quickly one that kind of becomes degrading of coalitions and kind of disintegrating the public good. And so it's a hard fight, but this is a fight that Dr. King led with and continues to be a shining example for all of us.
So I appreciate you mentioned the climate movement, because it's always occurred to me that that's a movement that typically lacks a human face. It's a movement that people often argue from the standpoint of the science, which makes it a less simpatico movement. I think, at least in some quarters, it's a difficult message because it's kind of sterile in terms of its community basis. And, where is this person, this human being who's directly affected by this climate injustice? And I feel like that's a missed opportunity for the climate activists to deprive it of that human connection, that community-based connection. Anyone else have a riff on that?
So I'll say two things. One is to commend the definition of environmental justice in Executive Order 14096 to everyone. And the way in which it ties into this is it repeats some language that we're familiar with in the environmental justice movement, that environmental justice means just treatment and meaningful involvement of all people. And then, as I said, it's regardless of race, color, national origin, income, and now also disability. And I would note that part of the reason disability, I think, got added there, or as I interpret it, is all of the recent information about who's most vulnerable to climate change. If we think about resilience, if we think about emergency response, if we think about some of the vulnerabilities, health vulnerabilities, et cetera, the intersection of race, color, national origin, income, tribal affiliation, and disability hits in this most vulnerable place. So that relates to climate. But then further, the definition goes on to say all people should be fully protected from disproportionate and adverse human health and environmental effects. And again, this isn't just aspirational. This is directing agencies to evaluate whether or not their rulemaking, their permitting, all their activities, their grant making has this disproportionate impact in light of climate change, as well as cumulative impacts and the legacy of racism and other structural barriers. But it's in light of climate change, which lifts up this intersection between climate change and issues of justice, which is an area a lot of environmental and climate justice activists have been at the forefront of, coming up with principles, advocating with decision makers, with states and with local governments and with federal governments. Climate justice advocates have been at the cutting edge, not only within this country, but also internationally, to lift up just the issue that you're raising. Just going back for a second, the other thing I wanted to just add is that in the environmental movement, and I started my career in the civil rights legal world, and then worked at an NGO in the environmental movement. Diversity and representation are critical, just as they are within the federal government. And so I was in an environmental NGO just at a time when it was trying to really transform, to take on issues of environmental justice in a way that it hadn't been before, at least not across the whole organization. And at the same time, look at its board, look at its staff, and say, do we represent the, is our composition representative of the people that we should be representing and engaging? And the answer to that was no, and we have to do better. And similarly at EPA, called upon by the Biden administration, yet another executive order that was signed in 2021, creating a government-wide initiative to promote DEIA. At EPA, similarly, we start with an agency that was really created from the conservation movement and the environmental movement, and has been transforming to put environmental justice and equity at the center of the agency, to recognize that we can't fulfill our mission unless we promote equity and target resources and target attention and protection for all people. So that goes hand in hand with a real emphasis on diversity and ensuring that we're representative of the country as a whole. And that involves, of course, DEIA plans, integrating diversity in our performance evaluations, all the things that it does out in the private sector. But I see those going hand in hand in transforming the whole environmental movement at state, local, federal levels in the nonprofit and for-profit sector. And it's a major change that is important if we're going to move equity and environmental justice forward.
Fred, you had asked the question about climate. So let's just give folks some facts. One, you cannot win on the climate crisis if you don't win on environmental injustice. It is impossible to do. We know where the majority of the fossil fuel facilities are located. They're located, in environmental justice communities primarily. When we look at who has been defending our forest and our jungles and our wetlands for millennia, it has been people of color. When we look at transportation policy in this country, which transportation is one of the other main drivers of the climate crisis, we know how disproportionately, unfortunately, I should say, that race was injected into transportation policy, bringing wealth into certain communities and dropping pollution off in others. So you can't win on climate if you don't win on environmental injustice. And luckily, we have an administration that is focused in many of those areas to help to address some of the egregious actions of the past. The other part of that is that the planet will be fine if we don't exist. What do I mean by that? When the traditional climate movement, you mentioned that folks never put people into the equation. Mm-hmm. So if hurricanes hit and there were no people here, it would continue to play out like it has since the beginning of time on this planet. All the other dynamics that we see going on. So we have to be focused on people. And when we're focused on people, that's when the climate justice movement has been playing a critical role in helping to put a spotlight on what's happening in the global south. How are people being impacted by these climate crises? What's going on right here in our country when we saw the wildfires that were happening in Canada and all that pollution got pushed into it. There were public health impacts that were going on. So you have to have people as the center of what's going on. And of course, for all my folks on the conservation side that I work with, also wildlife that are also impacted. But the reality is that when we don't have people as one of the main focuses of the sets of work that were going on, and of course our most vulnerable, then we were doing a disservice. Thankfully, we have evolved. And now that the climate movement has a much greater focus on people having a voice, on public health having a voice in that space. And that's why, as we move toward COP28, we have to make sure that the voices from frontline communities, from indigenous nations across our planet are first and foremost in helping to frame out the direction that we must go in, because it is about people. When we put people in, we began to put a heartbeat into the climate movement. And that's what we have always needed, along with some other things I'll talk about in relationship to culture.
I appreciate that. Thank you. if I can indulge, I had a visit recently. This is on point, on subject, from a scientist in Japan. He comes here periodically, Dr. Komatsu, wonderful guy, very, very, very smart, engaged guy who's an activist for sustainability in Japan. And he pointed out that he grew up in Fukushima. Everything he knew was destroyed. Everything he grew up with, the home he was born in, all that stuff. He says the country is invested in building these seawalls that are usually about half the height of the average tsunami. So while they produce jobs and make everybody happy, look, there's a seawall. In fact, he said it's rare in the history of Japan that anyone's ever had their life saved by a seawall. And so the question that he came here looking for an answer to, he went to the Chesapeake Bay program and asked if that was a jobs program, or do you guys actually intend to save that bay? That was really the question he wanted the answer to. He really couldn't get a good answer, because there are those overlays that people are looking at other than survivability, other than sustainability, right? They want to build seawalls because it's good for business, whether or not they actually really save people. And so that resonates with me, the idea that putting both people and reality, a reality check into some of these cause movements. You know, it's important to invest in these seawalls or these various programs or keep these various initiatives going. But what the outcome is that we want, we have to be pretty clear about. I've had the experience of asking the heads of big greens what their vision is for the outcome of these diversity and inclusion campaigns. And the worst answer I got was from a national green that said, I don't know, but funders like that. And that's a non-starter, I think, as far as getting the kind of movement that we need and deserve to save this planet. I'm not going to join a movement for that reason, right? Exactly, because there's no lucid vision for what this organization should look like if it were fully inclusive and fully just. So I do think we have to be very clear in our minds. We have to be very discerning about the outcomes we want, about the strategies that we have, the values that we're trying to uphold, or else we'll dither. We'll drift forever, or until we can drift no more.
Well, I'll just say this also, because I don't want to get my other panelists in any hot water, is that representation matters, and that in relationship to those who are making decisions, we have to make sure that there are individuals who come from the sets of experiences that are going on. So when we look at the leadership that exists inside of whether it is the big green organizations or foundations or our academic institutions, and luckily right now, in many instances on the Fed side, we seem to have finally been able to get a number of people in position who actually come from the work, then we're going to continue to have these ideas, some theory-based, some with maybe some real practicality in them, that are being financed and funded at a level that may not be what the majority of folks are looking for. But again, it comes back to representation, representation in sets of experiences, and representation in coming from the communities that have been diligently working for decades upon decades to make positive change happen.
Fair enough. We've got some questions in the comments, and thanks for drawing my attention to them. I didn't notice that they were there. First one up is, who's enforcing the agencies to do their job? Citizens press, but responsibilities are pushed back on the community. On the community to find the data.
I'll start with that. And I don't think there's a one-size answer, and your question really is a good one. So let me start, and other folks may have additional ideas about accountability. I think, first of all, accountability has to be built into the work. So Executive Order 14096, one of the animating ideas was to create greater accountability. And the concern was, as important as Executive Order 12898, signed by President Clinton, was, that it had a sort of one-time strategic plan involved for the agencies. And then what? How do we know what the agencies are going to do? How do we build accountability into that? So the new executive order calls on agencies, every 4 years, to come up with a strategic plan to integrate and advance environmental justice throughout all of their federal activities. And then every 2 years later, to assess their progress and to give a report that will be made public to on how they're doing and what are the barriers to moving that forward, and then taking those barriers into account in the next cycle. So that's one way of building accountability in. And then in those strategic plans, each agency is supposed to come up with metrics for evaluating their own progress as well. So this was an animating idea for having a new executive order to build accountability in. Now, making those plans and those reports public is a second piece, that if they're public, the stakeholders, EJ communities, others, can look at those plans and push back and advocate. And as burdensome as that can be, because sort of who has time to do everything, if there's more public transparency and public accountability, it gives information to communities, to the NGO sector, to EJ organizations, to other stakeholders to weigh in, to say this is an area, to petition the government. This is an area that needs to change. And so you create more of an iteration, more of an ongoing dialogue about what needs to happen. I will also say we're in this moment of data. And I don't want to ignore it. We were talking earlier about EJ Screen and the CDC tool. And of course, some of what they rely on is census information. But we have access to more data than has ever been the case in US history or in world history, right? The internet allows us to, and technology allows us to layer all this data. So we can go to our community, or we can look at a state and say, where are Superfund sites? Where are communities of color? Where are Indigenous communities? Where are poor white communities? Whatever it is that your question is, how long are we living? How many people have heart attacks? Whatever the issue is, and get that information. And therefore, really, from the ground up, identify what needs to change and hold government accountable for doing so. So those are just some beginnings of answer, that accountability has to be built into the work of local, state, and federal agencies, as well as other actors, but also the public, the stakeholders should be holding the government accountable. And I think that's central to our democracy.
Yeah, no, here. I mean, isn't that the way the system's supposed to work? Right? Absolutely. We need to make the system work the way it's supposed to work.
I think, Mr. Tubman, you are a great example of holding the government accountable, and you've shown how through advocacy and being willing to challenge people publicly in the press and through the use of law, we have to hold government entities accountable. And as a person who was, at EPA for 2 years in the administration, I tried to meet with communities and make that a regular part of the work that we did so we could hear from them. And find out what was working, what's not. And to be very honest, notwithstanding political leadership at the top who's committed to the issue, there is a suite of problems that have to be addressed that are overwhelming, to be very honest. The number of legacy cleanup sites that exist in this country, for example, were far too many for us to clean up at the same time. It just is not possible in light of the staff and in light of the resources that Congress has given the agency. And so unfortunately, though, the squeaky wheels does still get grease. So that means that people who come to the agency and say, this is our problem, we need you to focus on it, who will go to nonprofit organizations, who will go to the press, and who will go to court to say, these are the things that need to happen, and we will hold you accountable. We're not against you, agency, but if we have to sue you, we will sue you to make sure that you are doing what you're obligated to do. And I think I was not inclined to say that when I was working for the agency, but as a person running now an Environmental and Climate Justice Center, I can say that. And communities need to have that available, and we do need to hold government accountable and not take tools off the table that have been made available to us by law and are available to us as members of this society to say what needs to be done, and when it's not happening, to challenge people to do a better job.
That's actually the success story and the irony, I guess, of both a success and a failure of the Patuxent River movement. The only river in Maryland history to be substantially cleaned up, only to lose those gains over time, largely because it had a very politicized community base. That's why it's the only state river commission in Maryland. That's why it has all kinds of perks, that other rivers do not have, is because of that community basis and that dogged desire to hold the system accountable, basically, and that's something we tried to nurture. We call it keeping the pilot light on, because we're the inheritors of an existing movement that's been going on since the 1950s. where citizens have literally been suing the state government since the beginning of time to get this river cleaned up. And so they got some stuff. They got some stuff. It's not enough, but they got some stuff. And I think that's the formula. I've had to learn to operate well outside my own comfort zone on issues that I don't know. Let's just say I've never gone into politics because I know I'm a shallow enough guy that I only care about the stuff I care about. The moment they start talking about stuff I don't really care about, I know I'm done and I won't get elected. But I've found I've had to broaden that slate in order to get into communication with people, to have a wider view, a wider scope of my willingness to look at other issues and other approaches in order to create that community basis. So I'm amplifying what you're saying. I'm agreeing with you that I think that's really, really important. That's what I hang my hopes on as a riverkeeper nearing retirement, is that we keep that pilot light on so that the work carries forward. The communities own that work and will defend that work and will keep it moving forward. You know, I'm less confident that we could plant those seeds in a governmental administration and see those gains maintained over time, which kind of goes to one of the other questions in the chat here. How do we advance this stuff beyond the Biden-Harris administration? How do we keep these hopes and these programs and these ideas and these values alive?
Fred, can I just lift up one more mechanism for accountability that also goes to Vernice Miller-Travis's question about durability? So we talked about voting as a measure of accountability. We talked about structures within the government. We talked about litigation. And I think there are formal and informal ways of putting pressure and holding people accountable. But one other sort of formal mechanism that is, I think, important and increasingly so around the country is advisory committees, formalizing mechanisms for community input. So, of course, EPA has long had the National Environmental Justice Advisory Committee or Council, the NEJAC. We now have a White House Advisory Council, that's the WEJAC. But states all across the country have now developed advisory committees or bodies of some sort, sometimes reporting to a governor, sometimes reporting to a commissioner of Department of Environmental Quality. And they have different powers and different levels of effectiveness. Some of them are somewhat fledgling. Some of them have staff and funding. Some of them do not. But as folks think about forms of advocacy and ways of institutionalizing input, this is an important mechanism to put on the table in your local government, your state, or with our federal government, to find ways to build institutional mechanisms to have influence. None of these is by itself sufficient, but they are all part of a range of mechanisms to have dialogue, to put pressure, and to continue to hold decision makers accountable.
Excellent. We're closing in on our wrap time, so I'd like to give everybody a chance for kind of parting comments. Anything we missed or you'd like to make sure that we emphasize as a parting shot? Bueller.
I want to go back to accountability because I think this is such an important question, and it's one that I don't think we can undervalue. We need to build up our institutions so that they can hold the government accountable in these multiple ways we've talked about it. And that means we have to make investments in ourselves, in our communities, so we have the strong unity and the focus and the vision that enables us across administrations to continue to advance the ball. One of the things that you have to say about big green organizations, many of them, is that they've been around now for multiple decades doing this work and advancing their purposes. And across administrations, they're still there. They're bringing suits. They're calling people out. They're, talking to leadership to get regulations in place, to get rules in place, and to stop pollution in places that they want to challenge. We need those strong backbone kind of organizations. And there's a lot of grant money that's coming out right now, both through the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law, that enable communities to get resources to do that kind of development work. I want to encourage people who are community members to look at ways that you can strengthen your organization in order to better be able to hold people accountable, irrespective of what administration happens to be in office, because the quality of life that you have shouldn't be dependent on who won the presidential election. And so that means you've got to be strong enough to push, to advocate, irrespective of the governor, the city council, whomever, to make sure that you've got the protections that you need in environmental context and otherwise.
Understood.
I'll really quickly leave it to Mustafa to give us the final punch here, but just say I want to really emphasize community involvement in accountability. To all those folks who have joined us today, it's an honor to be part of this panel, but I hope what's getting across is that we have a lot we can do and that we have to keep pushing on all fronts. This is an unprecedented moment, and your involvement can really make a difference.
Mustafa?
Fred, you had mentioned, that you're in the fourth quarter of your career. So one, we want to thank you for everything that you've been doing for decades to really bring forward justice. But I think another part of that, for those of us who come out of the environmental justice movement, we know is about the intergenerational sets of opportunities that exist, and that we should be better funding those. When I was at EPA, before I left, we had created the first working group for youth in relationship to environmental justice and climate. And then recently the agency took and really expanded that and created these other sets of opportunities. So that's one of the things we have to focus on. The other one that we have to focus on is culture, right? So, the beauty of being at the hip hop caucus was understanding that if we truly want to integrate these issues, then we have to make sure that culture is playing a strong role in that space, whether it is through music or poetry or the arts or a number of other things. Then it begins to break down those silos and those walls that often exist between communities or between parties or whatever it might be. So we've got to do a better job there. And that's not just the job of the federal government. It is really a all of society set of approaches and actions that have to happen. The other part of it, and I appreciate what Professor Waterhouse was sharing, is when we're talking about resources, and if we really want to also help to build power inside of this country, then we've got to be doing a better job of supporting Black and Brown and Indigenous businesses in this space, because we understand that those who are in the business world often are playing a critical role in the policies that are being drafted on Capitol Hill and in state houses. So let's make sure that we are doing whatever we can to making sure that that becomes. And last, I'll just say that justice has to be a part of how we move forward. Our country, if you look at all the founding documents, always talk about justice. We find these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, endowed with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of justice. So just like folks in East Palestine want justice, folks in Cancer Alley want justice. And if we actually use that as our North Star, then we will be moving in a direction to make our country better, making sure that our most vulnerable communities are protected, and in totality, helping to make sure that we are living on a thriving planet.
Well said. Well, I want to thank this panel, this deeply thoughtful panel. And I hope the audience out there will also help us keep these conversations going forward. We need all the great minds, all the participation we can possibly get to bring home the type of planet that we really want. I most especially want to congratulate Mustafa on that excellent library. I see behind him, including some of my favorite authors. I see Say Their Names by our friend Caroline Brewer and others. Anyone in particular you want to point out as a reading recommendation for this audience? I'm a big bibliophile. Just all of them.
Every day.
every
day is the color. It's color of law every day.
Fair deal. Very good. All right. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing you folks in the trenches. Thanks for your time and thanks for your wisdom. Good day.
Thank you, Fred.
All right. Are we off? No, it says still live.
Thank you, everyone. Good seeing you all today.
Sure enough.
It still says live, by the way.
I know, I was smiling at that. I don't know if you remember Tom Wisner, the guy before he died. He was doing concerts. He was pretty far advanced in his cancer. And he said, still alive. He would cross that with a Sharpie, a poster. Performing tonight, still alive.